Something does not belong. Why is it connected to the afterlife? At first, that sounds like the kind of question that should have a clean answer. You hear a thing, you place it where it belongs, and that is usually enough. If something is tied to the afterlife, then you expect that connection to feel old, settled, almost obvious, like it has always been there. And for a moment, it does feel that way. You can almost accept it without stopping. Almost. But then something starts pressing against that idea. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough to make the connection feel a little too deliberate. A little too fixed. As if it was placed there and left there, even though it does not sit naturally. You keep looking at it the same way, expecting it to return to what makes sense. It does not. The connection stays there. It holds. But it does not feel the way it should feel. That is where it starts to become difficult to ignore. Because if it were only symbolic, that would be one thing. If it were only tradition, that would be one thing. But it does not remain that easy. It keeps standing there with the same quiet weight, and the more you try to leave it alone, the less settled it feels. So why is it connected to the afterlife? The first clue does not sit in a palace. It sits low against the wall of a tomb chapel, cut in stone. Squared at the sides, shallow at the seat, placed beside a false door, where offerings were meant to pass to someone no longer alive. Its proportions are wrong for use. The surface is too narrow, the setting too confined, the approach blocked by chapel architecture. If this is a throne, it is not waiting for a living body. That makes the placement feel straightforward. In funerary rooms, not audience halls. Beside offering points, not processional routes. A cult seat, then. Something belonging to the dead god whose presence was invited into burial space. The rear wall of another chamber seems to support that. Osiris is painted there, rigid and frontal, seated on a throne with the stillness of an image meant to receive rather than act. Nearby, on a limestone panel, offering formulas descend in columns beside a carved throne sign. Bread, beer, oxen, linen. The standard provisions for the dead. The arrangement almost closes the question. The throne belongs here because Osiris belongs here, and Osiris belongs here because the dead require him. But the fit is not complete. The stone platform beside the false door is not merely near the offering texts. It occupies the same visual field as the place where the deceased was expected to receive sustenance. If the throne marks only the god's seat, why is it installed where the dead person's access point is staged? Why does the offering formula run beside the throne sign rather than beside a figure of the tomb owner alone? The chapel seems to hold two destinations at once, and the architecture does not separate them cleanly. The painted Osiris on the burial chamber wall sharpens the problem. He is not shown in a vague, divine setting. He is enthroned, formal, fixed, and placed as a terminal image at the end of the room, where movement through the chamber visually stops. That suggests more than residence. It suggests arrival. A seat can mark presence, but it can also mark audience. Once that possibility appears, the surrounding funerary setting changes character. The throne-shaped platform is no longer just a cult furnishing. It begins to look like a station and a route the dead were expected to approach. Yet, the evidence remains stubbornly local. These are tomb chapels, burial chambers, mastaba panels. Nothing here requires a royal court model, and the ordinary ceremonial chairs of living rulers do not help much. Their contexts are public, mobile, and political. These seats are fixed, enclosed, and tied to mortuary provision. Even later damage in restored temples offers no useful comparison. The relevant surfaces here are original enough to preserve placement. So the first explanation still holds the room. The throne is connected to the afterlife because it appears where the dead are fed, named, and represented under Osiris' gaze. But the closer the scenes are measured against their settings, the less the throne behaves like a mere emblem of divine occupancy. It keeps turning up where exchange is expected, where access is staged, where the dead person's presence is implied, but not shown seated. If Osiris is only there to receive offerings, why is the space arranged as though someone must come before him? The first clue is not a throne in a room meant for the living. It is a sheet of funerary papyrus, unrolled flat, its fibers browned and split at the edges, with Osiris drawn at one end on a high-backed seat. The seat is formal, squared, elevated just enough to separate him from the standing figures before him. If the image were only devotional, that might be enough. A god shown in his proper posture, but the papyrus was folded for burial, stored with a body, carried into the coffin itself. That placement keeps pressing on the question. Why send an image of a seated god into a sealed box, unless the scene was expected to matter after death? A second vignette narrows it. Here the dead person is not merely near Osiris in some general sacred setting. The figure stands before him, smaller, directed toward the throne, arranged as if entering an audience. The spacing is deliberate. Osiris occupies the fixed end of the composition. The deceased approaches. The throne begins to look less like furniture and more like a destination inside a sequence. That would explain the papyrus in the coffin. The dead were not being buried with a pious picture. They were being equipped with a root, or at least with the image of one. Arrival before Osiris, appearance in his presence, acceptance under his gaze. For a moment, the arrangement seems clean. The mummy in its coffin, the folded papyrus near the legs, the enthroned god at the end of the painted register, the dead person standing before him. These fit together almost too neatly. The throne belongs to the afterlife, because it marks the place where the dead hope to be received. The burial object and the burial image reinforce each other. A seat in a tomb context becomes the seat before which one must appear. Then the details begin to crowd the edges of that explanation. On some papyri, the enthroned Osiris is not isolated in a single final audience. The surrounding scenes continue beyond him in ways that are not easy to reduce to one moment of judgment. The dead are led, presented, named, sometimes accompanied by formulae that function as protection as much as introduction. If the throne marks only a hearing, why is the document itself treated like equipment? Folded and placed with the body, as though it must travel with the deceased rather than simply commemorate a hoped-for verdict. The coffin context makes that harder to ignore. A papyrus tucked near the legs is not displayed. It is deposited. Its usefulness, whatever that meant, was expected to begin when the tomb was closed. That suggests performance after burial, not just memory of a divine court. Yet, the image still insists on approach. The dead before Osiris, Osiris on the throne. The composition organized around encounter. So the throne now carries two pressures at once. It looks like the fixed point of a formal appearance before the ruler of the dead. But the object bearing that scene behaves like something meant to accompany and enable the dead through a longer passage. If the throne is only where judgment happens, why is the whole document buried as if the dead will need it beyond that single moment? And if the papyrus is a guide through the afterlife, why does so much of its visual force gather around one seated figure, waiting at the end? The first thing that holds attention is not a throne in a palace sense at all, but a painted seat on the side of a coffin. The figure on it is unmistakable. Green-faced, rigid, frontal, crook, and flail, crossed over the chest, seated on a square block throne with no sign of movement or ceremony around him. The image is compressed into a funerary surface. It belongs to the coffin, not to a hall of rule. That had suggested at first a devotional presence carried into burial. Osiris shown because the dead wish to be near him. Then the inner coffin panel adds language the image alone does not. Black ink lines divide the wood into registers, and above the text bands the title of Osiris is written with formal emphasis. The wording is not casual praise. It places him in office. Ruler of the West, Lord of the Dead. Titles of jurisdiction, not merely identity. Once those lines are read beside the enthroned figure, the seat begins to look less like a symbol of divine presence, and more like a fixed point of authority. The coffin is not only decorated with Osiris, it is arranged under his rule. That begins to answer the afterlife question. The throne matters because it marks where power over the dead resides. The deceased enters a domain, and that domain already has a seated ruler. The image on the coffin side, The title above the text, the repeated funerary invocations, all align neatly enough that the explanation feels solid for a moment. The throne is connected to the afterlife because Osiris governs the dead from it. A small object on a mummy's chest complicates the neatness. Among strings of beads lies a tiny amulet, only a few centimeters high, shaped as an enthroned figure. It is not a scene. It is not part of a wall composition or a coffin program. It is portable, reduced, worn against the body. If the throne only marks the distant seat of a ruler in the next world, why miniaturize it and fasten it to the dead themselves? The scale matters. A coffin panel can proclaim authority at the level of inscription and image. An amulet has to function differently. It travels with the wrapped body, pressed into the burial assemblage where protective devices usually cluster. That suggests the enthroned form was expected to do something in proximity, not merely remind anyone of who ruled beyond the tomb. Yet the figure remains seated, formal, sovereign. Protection and authority are now occupying the same shape. The coffin texts sharpen the problem instead of resolving it. They invoke Osiris as Lord of the Dead, but they do so in formulas intended to benefit the person inside the coffin. The authority named there is not abstract. It is being activated for one burial at a time. So is the throne a sign of government over the dead, or a mechanism by which that government reaches each individual corpse? The evidence keeps pressing in one direction. The enthroned Osiris on the coffin wall establishes rank. The title above the text gives him territorial command. The amulet on the chest brings that enthroned form into intimate funerary use. Together, they make the afterlife connection stronger, not weaker. But they also leave an awkward practical question lying in the burial itself. If the throne belongs to the ruler of the dead, why does its image keep moving closer to the dead body? At first, the throne seems easy to place. In burial material, it keeps turning up where afterlife judgment would be expected. But on one painted panel, the arrangement is awkward for that reading. The upper register gives the familiar image. Osiris seated frontally on a throne, rigid, composed, receiving attention. Directly beneath it, on the same surface, his body is shown laid out in separated sections. The two images are not far apart. They are stacked. If the throne only marks the place where the dead are judged, why is the dismembered body of the god placed immediately below it, as though the seated figure depends on the body being put back together? That question becomes harder to avoid in the ritual rooms. A grain-filled mold shaped like a wrapped body survives in enough detail to show intention, not decoration. The cavity follows the length of a corpse. Green shoots rise from the packed grain. This is not a courtroom image. It behaves like a timed process. Burial shape, moisture, germination, emergence. The afterlife connection is still there, but now it looks less like appearance before a ruler and more like a model of return. If Osiris is the dead god who rises again, then the throne may mark the condition reached after restoration, not merely the seat from which verdicts are issued. For a moment, that seems to settle the problem. The throne belongs to the afterlife because it shows Osiris restored after death, and the dead wanted the same outcome. Then the wall texts complicate the neatness of that answer. In one scene, an enthroned Osiris stands beside vertical columns of resurrection spells. The pairing is exact enough to matter. The spells do not simply describe revival in general terms. They cluster beside the seated figure itself. The throne is not elsewhere in the composition, not a background emblem, but attached to the written machinery of reanimation. That makes the seat look active in the right. Yet if restoration is the main point, why preserve the enthroned posture at all? A standing, emerging, or reassembled body would seem more direct. Instead, the restored state is pictured as seated rule. The panel with the divided body now reads differently. The lower image is not just narrative background to the upper one. It may be a sequence compressed into one surface. Broken body below, restored authority above. But that raises another difficulty. Authority over what? If the throne marks successful reconstitution, why does it retain the formal stillness associated with command? Why not show simple survival? The grain bed presses the question further. Its whole logic is agricultural renewal, not legal judgment. Yet the throne scenes paired with resurrection texts do not abandon rank, insignia, or fixed posture. Rebirth alone does not account for that. Something in these funerary settings requires both conditions at once. The god must return, and when he returns, he must return enthroned. So the afterlife link no longer rests comfortably on judgment by itself. The evidence in these rooms keeps placing the throne where restoration is being enacted, written, or materially imitated. But the restored figure is never merely alive again. He is restored into position. The unresolved point is whether that position belongs to Osiris alone, or whether the dead, by entering these rites, were aiming at the same seated condition. On one coffin lid, the owner's name does not stand alone. It follows the sign for Osiris, written in the same black line as the rest of the inscription, not added later, not squeezed into a margin. The formula runs cleanly across the wood. Offerings, invocations, protection, and then the dead person named as Osiris. If the throne belonged only to a god receiving the dead, that wording is awkwardly precise. Why rename the deceased at the exact point where identity should be fixed? The lid gives one answer. The body beneath it gives another. A gilded mummy mask carries a false beard, and the striped headdress, usually reserved for divine or royal display. The linen wrapping below remains human in scale, narrow at the shoulders, ordinary in proportion. The face above it is not ordinary at all. It does not depict a petitioner approaching a throne. It presents someone already altered for a role. The afterlife connection begins to look less like access to a court, and more like preparation for resemblance. The dead are not only asking Osiris for admission, they are being equipped to share his condition. That reading settles neatly beside the texts. Coffin inscriptions repeatedly attach the dead person's name to Osiris. The regalia on the mask gives the body the same visual grammar. A funerary scroll extends the pattern further. Among divine figures, a justified dead person appears seated on a throne-like seat, not standing in fear, not kneeling for sentence, but placed in a posture that echoes the enthroned god. At that point, the throne seems to explain itself. It is connected to the afterlife because it models what the deceased hopes to become: stable, justified, restored, enthroned. Then the details on the scroll begin to interfere. The seat under the dead person is not identical to the heavy block throne under Osiris in other scenes. Its back is lighter, its proportions less monumental, almost intermediate between divine furniture and a ceremonial chair. The figure seated there lacks the full crook and flail authority of Osiris. Nearby captions stress justification rather than rule. If this is enthronement, what kind is it? Shared sovereignty? Symbolic elevation? Or a temporary liturgical image? The coffin lid complicates it further. The phrase naming the deceased as Osiris appears in funerary context after funerary context. But not every burial with that formula includes throne imagery. Some bodies receive the name without the seat. Some receive divine styling in the mask, but no enthroned vignette. If becoming Osiris were the whole point, why is the throne present in some burial programs and absent in others? The title travels more widely than the image, and the image itself is not fixed. On one scroll, the justified dead person sits among divine beings. On another object, Osiris alone occupies the formal seat while the deceased remains before him. The afterlife link is still there, but it now divides into two physical arrangements. One in which the dead approach restored authority, another in which they seem to participate in it. The throne may mark transformation, but it also preserves distance. So the question narrows rather than closes. Is the throne in these burials a promise of likeness, a staged result of ritual, or a sign borrowed from a deeper claim about who may rightfully sit, rule, and return after death? The first thing that seems to settle the question is the wall itself. In one painted register, Horus stands directly behind the seated Osiris, one hand lifted in a formal gesture. The throne front-facing and squared, the god rigid, restored, unmistakably installed rather than merely present. In funerary rooms, that arrangement is hard to ignore. If the dead are buried under the authority of Osiris, and Horus is the heir who returns him to rule, then the throne's afterlife meaning begins to look inherited from kingship, not a random seat in the next world, but a restored office. Rule interrupted, then resumed. That reading gains weight, a few meters away. In a burial chamber, crook, flail, and a ceremonial headdress lie arranged beside a coffin. Their spacing is deliberate. The regalia are not worn, not in use, but placed as if office could survive as equipment. The crook and flail belong to Osiris in funerary images, but they also belong to kingship. If burial assemblages borrow coronation forms, then afterlife belief may have been built from older political language. Rightful succession, recovered rule, continuity after rupture. That would explain why the throne matters. The dead do not simply approach it. They enter a condition defined by it. For a moment, the pieces lock together. Horus restores. Osiris reigns. The dead are buried with signs of office because death is being framed as accession under Osiris. Then the corridor block complicates the chamber. Reused stone, cut from a temple and set into a tomb passage, carries a royal name ring. Inside it, the carved throne hieroglyph is crisp enough to survive the recutting around it. Here the throne sign is not furniture, not a platform, not even a scene. It is embedded in a name tied to sovereignty itself. That pushes the problem backward. If the throne sign already belongs to royal titulary, then the funerary throne may not be borrowing from a developed afterlife system at all. It may be inheriting a much older grammar of legitimacy. But if that is so, why does the evidence refuse to stay royal? The restoration scene is in a tomb, not a palace. The regalia lie beside a coffin, not in a coronation hall. Royal language appears where the dead are being provisioned, named, and transformed. The usual boundary, king here, ordinary dead there, does not hold cleanly against the surfaces. Tomb texts merge kings with Osiris, but later burials spread Osirian identity far beyond kingship. The throne's connection to the afterlife cannot rest on royalty alone, if non-royal dead are also drawn into the same visual field. And there is a practical inconsistency in the imagery. In the restoration scene, Horus stands. Osiris sits. Succession should move power forward, yet the image returns it backward to the dead ruler. The afterlife connection may depend less on inheritance as transfer, than on inheritance as recovery. The lost ruler made present again, the dead made legitimate by entering that restored order. Still, that leaves the chamber floor unsettled. Are the crook and flail there because the deceased is king, because he hopes to become Osiris, or because funerary ritual absorbed the signs of sovereignty until restored rule itself became a model for surviving death? The throne keeps answering one question by opening an older one. The wall painting seems straightforward at first. High on the plaster, Osiris sits on a throne, frontal and still, while below him rows of kneeling dead face inward in ordered bands. The scene is funerary, not civic. No audience hall, no living court, no sign that this seat belonged to ordinary rule. In that arrangement, the connection to the afterlife looks almost complete. The dead are present. Osiris is elevated above them, and the throne marks the place from which judgment is given. That reading holds as long as the wall is considered by itself. But in another register, on a festival relief from a different context, Osiris appears upright again on a throne platform amid ritual emblems. Not in a courtroom arrangement, but in a setting concerned with restoration. The platform is not merely a place to receive the dead. It belongs to a sequence in which a broken god is made whole and set up again. If the throne only marked judgment, why is it fixed just as firmly to rites of reanimation? The burial texts answer part of that. On coffin boards, the inscriptions do not simply invoke Osiris from a distance. They rename the dead as Osiris. Above the text bands, a painted throne rises as a repeated sign, and the wording below it folds the deceased into the god's identity. That makes the funerary logic tighter, not looser. The dead are not only approaching a ruler in the next world, they are trying to enter his condition. The throne would then belong to afterlife hope, because it marks restored existence under Osiris, and, in some sense, as Osiris. Yet the chamber floor complicates the sequence again. Around a sealed sarcophagus lie funerary equipment and coronation-style regalia in the same confined space. Crook-like forms, formal headdress elements, objects arranged with burial purpose, but carrying the visual language of accession. These are not random intrusions from a palace store. Their placement is too close to the coffin, too integrated with the burial set. If the throne signifies renewed life for the dead, why does the material around it keep borrowing the grammar of rightful rule? The answer seems near at hand in the combined imagery. Osiris is not restored privately. He is restored to authority. In judgment scenes he presides. In ritual scenes he is raised. In coffin texts the deceased takes his name. In burial assemblages sovereignty signs accompany the passage into death. The throne gathers these functions into one visible form. It is afterlife furniture only if afterlife includes rule, recognition, and successful return from death. But even that broader explanation leaves awkward details in place. The kneeling dead beneath the judgment scene remain distinct individuals, not fully merged beings. The coffin inscriptions, by contrast, erase that distance by naming the deceased as Osiris outright. The festival relief centers a god restored in ritual time, while the chamber floor preserves regalia as if succession itself had been packed for transport into the tomb. Are these all versions of one idea, or are several older meanings sharing the same seat? The throne keeps answering the question and reopening it. It belongs to the afterlife because the dead meet Osiris there, because he rules there, because he rises there, because the deceased hopes to occupy that restored state. But the more completely those pieces fit together, the harder it becomes to tell which of them came first, and whether the afterlife borrowed the throne from kingship, or kingship had already been speaking the language of the dead.